Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always. What are we looking at today?
Today, we're heading into the heart of the recent events in Gaza.
Okay.
Specifically, we're going to focus on what's been happening at two hospitals, Nasser Hospital and Kamal Adwan Hospital.
Sounds heavy.
It is. And to make things even more challenging, we're dealing with reports from both the BBC and Al Jazeera.
So we're getting perspectives from both sides of the conflict.
Exactly, which, as you can imagine, makes getting a clear picture pretty tricky.
Definitely adds another layer of complexity.
But hey, that's what we're here for, right? To dig into those tough sources and try to make sense of it all.
Absolutely. Unpacking the complexities is the only way to really understand what's going on.
All right, let's jump right in. The first article from the BBC centers around Nasser Hospital and the testimony of a retired British surgeon, Professor Nizam Mahmood.
Okay.
He volunteered at the hospital, and he recently spoke before the British Parliament. Well, his testimony is, to put it mildly, disturbing. He alleges that Israeli drones were deliberately used to target injured children.
Targeted children.
Yeah, after bombing raids.
Wow. That's a serious accusation. What evidence does he present?
That's what makes his testimony so powerful. He goes into very specific details.
Like?
Well, he doesn't just say drones were used. He describes them picking off civilians' children right after the bombs were dropped.
Oh, man.
He even talks about personally removing cuboid pellets from the abdomens of these children.
Cuboid pellets. What are those?
He explains that these pellets are fired by drones and are, in a way, even more destructive than bullets.
How so?
They fragment on impact, which means a single pellet can cause multiple internal injuries.
Jeez.
And to really drive home the horror of what he witnessed, he describes operating on a 7-year-old boy.
Oh, no.
Thankfully, the boy survived.
That's a small mercy, at least.
It is, but he suffered extensive internal injuries from just one of these pellets.
It's hard to even imagine.
It is, and it raises some really tough questions, about potential changes in Israeli military tactics, whether international law is being upheld.
Big questions.
Yeah. And it's worth noting that Sarah Champion, who chairs the committee Professor Mahmoud spoke to, has actually called for investigations into potential breaches of international law based on his testimony.
Wow. So this is being taken very seriously.
It is, and understandably so. But as difficult as it is to hear this, we need to try and look at the bigger picture.
Meaning?
This testimony comes amidst the ongoing Israel-Gaza conflict. And we can't forget that this conflict began with the Hamas attack on Israel.
Right. The one that claimed the lives of about 1,200 people and resulted in over 100 hostages still unaccounted for.
That's the one. A horrific attack.
Absolutely.
And the Israeli military response has, according to the Hamas-run health ministry, resulted in a reported 43,712 deaths in Gaza.
Those numbers are just staggering.
They are.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important to acknowledge that the casualty figures from both sides differ significantly. So it's hard to get a truly accurate picture of the toll.
Yeah, the fog of war makes it tough to get solid information.
Exactly. And of course, we have to consider the Israeli military stance.
Which is?
They maintain that they do not target civilians intentionally. And they accuse Hamas of using the population as human shields.
Which brings us to another incredibly difficult topic. Human shields.
Right. And we actually have an academic report here that dives into this very tactic.
From both sides.
Yes, from the perspectives of both Hamas and Israel.
That's interesting.
And it's really important to emphasize, this report doesn't take sides, it just analyzes the issue objectively.
Trying to understand the motivations and the implications, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's really fascinating here is how they break down the rationale behind using human shields. Well, they explain how groups like Hamas might see it as a necessary tactic, especially when they're facing a militarily superior force, like Israel.
I see. So from Hamas's perspective, they're basically saying, we have to use whatever means necessary to resist.
Right. And any civilian casualties are the fault of Israel for attacking us.
Yeah, I can see how they would frame it that way.
And the report also presents the Israeli perspective.
Which is?
Well, they argue that Hamas deliberately endangers civilians to gain international sympathy and to limit Israel's military options.
So you can see how these opposing narratives just create this incredibly complex situation.
Absolutely. And it gets even more complicated when you look at specific examples of how human shields have been used.
Are there any specific examples in the report?
There are some very sobering ones. It describes how Hamas has been accused of launching rockets from populated areas
Oh, wow.
and strategically placing military infrastructure near civilian buildings.
Deliberately putting civilians at risk.
Right. And even more disturbing are the claims that they use civilians to protect or rescue fighters, force them to dig tunnels for military purposes.
Putting them in danger of cave-ins or being targeted by Israel?
Exactly. And then they exploit the resulting civilian casualties. For propaganda and fundraising, it's a pretty grim picture.
It is, and it sounds like Hamas has very specific strategic goals in using these tactics.
They do, according to the report.
So let's hear it. What are they trying to achieve?
Well, one of the main objectives is to restrict the IDF's freedom of action. Meaning the presence of civilians makes it extremely difficult for the Israeli military to operate effectively.
I can see that. It's a terrible choice. Hold back and risk Israeli lives, or attack and face international backlash for causing civilian casualties.
Exactly. It's a classic no-win situation. And that's exactly what Hamas is trying to create. A dilemma for Israel. Force them to choose between protecting their own people and adhering to international law.
A cynical calculation, but it seems to be working.
At least to some extent. Okay, so where do we go from here? Well, let's shift gears and talk about Kamal Adwan Hospital. We have some pretty harrowing reports from Al Jazeera about what happened there. We're talking heavy artillery fire, air attacks, and even Israeli forces storming the hospital itself.
Whoa. This sounds intense.
It is. And the casualty figures are difficult to pin down.
How so?
One Al Jazeera article, reporting live from the scene, said at least 29 people were killed.
Okay.
But another article, focusing more on Gaza news, put the number at 30, including 4 members of the hospital staff.
That's awful.
It is. And then you have the accounts from the hospital staff themselves. Dr. Eid Saba, the director of nursing at Kamal Adwan, claims that Israeli forces entered the hospital in disguise.
In disguise?
Yeah. He says they were wearing different uniforms, and they ordered everyone to evacuate.
To where?
Towards their tanks. He's essentially accusing them of leading people into a trap.
Oh, man.
And it doesn't stop there. There are also allegations that Israeli drones were used to target people inside the hospital.
This is heavy stuff.
It is. And understandably, the Palestinian Health Ministry has declared this incident a war crime.
Well, attacking hospitals is a clear violation of international law, under the Geneva Conventions.
Exactly. But of course, there's another side to this story. Israel claims that Hamas was using the hospital for cover.
Which Hamas denies.
Vehemently.
Yeah.
So, as you can imagine, it's incredibly difficult to sort out the truth, who to believe.
Right. You have these conflicting accounts, and it becomes almost impossible to determine what actually happened.
Exactly. And then you have the perspective of Dr. Mads Gilbert.
Who's that?
He's a Norwegian doctor who's worked in Gaza for a long time. He's seen a lot.
And what's his take?
He believes the hospital was intentionally used as a trap to attract people seeking safety, who were then attacked.
Wow. So we have accusations of a deliberate massacre.
It's a horrifying thought. And the World Health Organization has also expressed deep concern about the bombing of the hospital.
What are they saying?
They're pointing out that no warning was given to staff. And they're really highlighting the dire situation facing other hospitals in northern Gaza, which are under repeated attacks. We're talking about a major humanitarian crisis here.
Absolutely. And to make matters even worse, there was an airstrike on an ambulance near Kamal Adwan Hospital.
Yeah, I read about that.
And with these ongoing attacks and severe fuel shortages, most ambulances in Gaza are now unusable.
So they can't even transport the wounded.
Exactly. It's a desperate situation.
It is. And then you add another layer to this. The accusations that Israeli forces used human shields during the evacuation of Kamal Adwan Hospital.
Wait, what?
Yeah. The claim is that they forced Palestinian detainees to warn others to leave.
Putting those detainees in direct danger.
Exactly. If true, it's a tactic that raises serious ethical and legal questions.
Absolutely. This whole situation is it's incredibly disturbing.
It is.
It really highlights the brutal realities of war, especially for the civilians who are caught in the crossfire.
No doubt. And the use of human shields just adds another layer of horror to it all. It's a tactic that's sadly been used in conflicts for centuries.
Yeah, it's nothing new, but that doesn't make it any less awful.
Right. So going back to the report, what are the main goals behind using human shields? What is Hamas actually hoping to achieve?
Well, like we touched on earlier, the report highlights a few key objectives. First, there's the idea of limiting the IDF's ability to act. By putting civilians in harm's way, Hamas forces the Israeli military into a terrible position.
They're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Exactly. They can either hold back and risk their own soldiers' lives, or attack and face international condemnation for causing civilian casualties.
So it's a calculated move to box Israel in.
Precisely. It's a way for Hamas to try and level the playing field, in a sense, against a much stronger military force.
But it's not just about limiting Israel's actions, right?
Right. There's also the goal of winning international sympathy.
The classic hearts and minds campaign.
You got it. Those images of Palestinian civilians, especially children, suffering because of Israeli military actions, well, they're bound to generate outrage and condemnation around the world.
It's a powerful propaganda tool.
It is, and that can lead to real pressure on governments to censure Israel, maybe even impose sanctions.
So Hamas is leveraging international opinion, even if it means putting their own people at risk.
That's the really tragic part.
The report also mentioned something else, right? About creating divisions within Israel itself.
Yeah, that's another goal.
Yeah.
By focusing on the moral dilemmas, the sensitivities surrounding civilian casualties, Hamas is hoping to sow discord, to weaken Israel's resolve.
So it's not just about external pressure, it's about exploiting internal fault lines within Israel too.
Exactly. It's a long game, aiming to chip away at Israel's legitimacy, both domestically and internationally.
It's a pretty chilling strategy when you think about it.
It is. But it's important to understand their motivations.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it also raises the question, how does Israel respond to this? It seems like they're in an impossible situation.
Well, the report goes into some detail about the approaches Israel takes to try and counter this human shield tactic.
Like what?
One key element is their emphasis on using precision weaponry.
To minimize collateral damage.
Exactly. The idea is to target only military objectives, to avoid hitting civilians.
But even with precision weapons, isn't it almost impossible to avoid civilian casualties? Especially in a place as densely populated as Gaza.
You're absolutely right, and that's why Israel also uses early warning systems.
Like the roof-knocking tactic.
Yep, that's one. Dropping non-explosive devices on a building as a warning before they actually bomb it. They also use phone calls, text messages, leaflets to warn civilians before an attack.
But didn't the report mention that Hamas actually discourages people from listening to those warnings?
Yeah, they do. They claim it's all psychological warfare. Just another way for Israel to manipulate the situation.
So how does Israel deal with that?
That's where information warfare comes in.
Information warfare.
Basically, it's about trying to control the narrative. Israel puts out their own accounts of what happened. They release footage that supposedly shows Hamas using human shields, and they really emphasize their own efforts to avoid civilian casualties.
So it's a battle for public opinion, as much as it is a military one.
Exactly. It's all about perception.
But at the end of the day, what are the real consequences of all of this? For both sides.
Well, for Israel, the use of human shields has led to pretty intense international criticism and legal challenges.
It's hurt their reputation.
Yeah, it's damaged their image, put a strain on their relationships with other countries, and it's made it much harder for them to justify their actions on the world stage.
They're constantly having to defend themselves against accusations of war crimes and human rights violations.
Exactly. And for Hamas, well, they might be achieving some of their short-term goals.
Like winning propaganda points.
Right. But the long-term consequences for their own people are often really devastating. They might be scoring some victories in the media, but the cost is innocent Palestinian lives.
It's a terrible price to pay.
The report makes it clear. Using human shields, even if it works tactically in the short run, ultimately just makes things worse in the long run. It perpetuates the cycle of violence and suffering in the region.
It's a tragic situation. And finding a solution seems almost impossible.
It's incredibly complex. There are no easy answers. But it's important for us to understand these complexities, to try to see how each side is operating in this incredibly difficult and dangerous environment.
I agree. It's about getting a more complete picture.
Yeah.
It really shows you that nothing is ever black and white.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why these sources have been so valuable, even though they're coming from different sides of the conflict.
Totally. They've given us a chance to, really peel back those layers, see things from multiple perspectives.
Exactly. And while we may not have come to any easy answers, I think this kind of in-depth understanding is so important.
It is. It makes us think critically, doesn't it?
It does. And it forces us to face those uncomfortable realities.
Because it's easy to just, fall into those oversimplified narratives.
Yeah.
Good guys versus bad guys.
Right. But the truth is, it's just way more complicated than that.
Always. So where does this leave us? What are some things we should really take away from all of this, especially focusing on these hospitals caught in the middle of it all?
Well, I think the biggest thing for me is the human cost. All those stories, the injured children, the families that have been torn apart, the healthcare workers struggling to provide care. It's heartbreaking.
It's a good reminder that this isn't just some abstract political debate, right?
Right. These are real people whose lives have been shattered.
It really emphasizes the need for a solution, somehow.
It does. But finding that solution is, well, it's incredibly difficult, especially when both sides feel like they're in the right.
It's a situation that can leave you feeling kind of helpless.
Mm-hmm.
So what can we do as individuals after all this?
That's a good question. I think the most important thing is to stay engaged. Don't let the complexity or even the despair shut you down.
Yeah.
Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep challenging your own assumptions.
Because the more we understand, the better equipped we are to, have those difficult conversations, advocate for change.
Exactly. And never underestimate the power of empathy. Even if you don't agree with someone's perspective, try to understand where they're coming from.
Because that's how we bridge those divides.
Yeah.
Maybe even start to find some common ground.
I think so.
Well, thank you for taking us through all of this. It's been a tough one, but a necessary one.
I agree.
And to you, our listener, we encourage you to keep digging. Read more, listen to different voices, and don't ever stop searching for the truth, even when it's hard.
Remember, even in the fog of war, there's always truth to be found. It just takes effort and an open mind to see it.
That's a good note to end on. Until next time, everyone, stay curious and keep diving deep.